Okay, I think I'll divide the videos for week 11, the fatigue process, to two or three parts to make it easier on me, and then also make the files a bit smaller. I'm not going to go over every point. Some of them I think are pretty simple to understand, but I want to make sure that you feel comfortable, free, and understand that if there's anything that I don't address in the presentation, and that perhaps my estimation that you would get it, or you have the background to do it, and I mean no offense by that, not at all, by the way, that you will reach out and say, hey, Moran, you didn't talk about the second point in slide 40. Do you mind explaining that? And then I'll do that. I don't really think I need to go over every point, but I'll try and emphasize the major points. And what I always do before I record a video is I go over the presentation, I read every word, and I write remarks on the side. And I'll just show you so you understand where it's coming from. You see, there's remarks on the sides for things that I would like to emphasize. So, with that said, let's start. I'm going to um, address what I wrote in big letters in slide 4 to start with. Um, and just want to remind you that fatigue, by definition, is the inability to conduct work. And we must connect to that. We must understand the basic definition of work, which you have already been taught, in order to understand how important fatigue is. Of course, we have partial fatigue and maximal fatigue, and we have fatigue of different organs and different systems and different origins. But fatigue, by definition, is the inability to conduct work. Partial fatigue is the partial inability to conduct work, meaning that we expect the outcome of the system's work to be lessen or zero. Zero is obviously a bad situation in most examples. And that is why, since work is life, since a system is supposed to produce work, is supposed to produce an outcome, fatigue is an amazing, intriguing, and very important process that we as physiologists and exercise physiologists and clinical exercise physiologists must understand. So please understand what this chapter is talking about, what this unit is talking about, what this presentation is talking about. We're talking about reasons for a system not to be able to fully achieve the result that it should. So we are entering the domain whereas we don't say, no, we're limitless. We are limited. Now let's understand why and when and how. Okay, so that's what the presentation is about. Um, then I want to address the third point on the next slide, slide number 5. And that third point um, talks about an interesting idea, whereas fatigue, by definition, the lowering of the ability to conduct work, I'll say this a thousand times if needed, might have been, might exist before exercising. We always think, oh, you exercise so you were tired. No, fatigue could have been uh, um, in the background when you were exercising. It could be it could be there, before damage occurred, and so on and so forth. Um, then I would like to jump to Slide number 7, and obviously when we're talking about something that is central versus peripheral, that is an iconic comparison between the central system, meaning the central nervous system, and the peripheral, meaning non-central, everything from there outwards. Then I marked in green the second point on slide 7. I'd like slide 8, sorry. I would like to read it out loud in the video to have you hear it. And I wrote, the common ground for all 8 is the fact that they all affect skeletal muscle voluntary force production. Meaning, what is a muscle supposed to do? Produce force. Why? To induce movement. Okay, most likely. So all of these sites are going to affect the process of the muscle's ability to produce force. And then on slide 9, the only point that exists there focuses sites 5 to 8 on the as more important to athletes, and to emphasize that athletes obviously have a performance aspect to what they do. They are supposed to be first, and if they're second today, tomorrow they're supposed to do everything possible to be first next time. So this is a bit of a difference in comparison to someone which is not an athlete, that does not, or even works out but is not competing. It's a completely different level of performance and results that we, or work that we expect from our muscles. I want to explain in regards to slide 11 two things. First of all, HMCs are heavy myosin chains, meaning those are the thick filaments of the sarcomere. The sarcomere is the basic unit of the muscle that produces power or strength. And then often in the body and in mechanics, in life, there's a difference between the speed that things are done at versus the quality or the capacity of things that things are done at. And in the majority of time, there's not a full contradiction, but there is a relationship or a balance between how fast something happens and how high quality the outcome could be, or how high the outcome at all could be. So those two ideas occur in the muscle. You can ask a muscle to work slow or to work fast. Then the question is, what are you gaining and what are you losing? And in this case, you can't really eat the cake and keep it as a whole. So that is the balance or the choices that are brought up, presented in slide 11. The muscle has to choose. Then obviously, since you are creating some kind of balance, or what we would call a ratio or a relationship, because now you are dependent upon at least two factors, in this case speed versus develop a force, the outcome being the muscle's work or power produced is the result of multiple different balances that could be produced. So obviously the muscle has a wide range of results that can be produced, and we know that because we know we can produce different strength and power from our muscles. We can produce very little if we need to be sensitive and delicate, or working with delicate matters or situations, and we can produce maximal power, explosive power, when we need it. Then on slide 12, we see that the muscle has two states that are governed by chemical processes. The one is a low state of power production. The second one is a high state of power production. And for some reason, what comes to mind is a scrambler. So let's say you have eggs, um, in a container, and you want to scramble them, right? And you're using an electric scrambler, and it has two speeds. The first speed is going to do it slowly. The second one is going to do it really fast. So those two speeds represents two different levels of force. Okay, two different levels of strength. And the muscle, the sarcomere, can have chemically two different levels of strength of its connections. The higher the strength of the connection, the more stable the sarcomere is mechanically. And the more stable the sarcomere is, the higher the power that we can get. So I want you to think about this as a switch, so to speak, between two states of existence. Relatively low stability, hence relatively low power, versus relatively high stability of the sarcomere, relatively high production of power. And that's exactly what we see in slide 13. You don't have to remember their reactions. I don't care if you remember their reactions. I care that you remember, for example, that there's two states and what it means. I don't even care if you remember that reaction 5 is what I call the switch. Okay? So just to be clear. Let's see. Then we can talk about the process being bidirectional or not unidirectional, meaning it's not one directional, which I think is great because that allows us to save energy if needed, and then accommodate certain power needs with the sarcomere's chemical state or mechanical state. So that allows us fine-tuning of how much energy we are investing and how much we are using our muscles in order to achieve a certain mission or outcome. In this case, I just wanted also to talk about the word rate. The word rate is a balance between outcome and time. And since you can't divide anything by zero, and since actual actions, movements, processes take at least some kind of time, no matter how minimal it is, as long as it's not zero, that means that rate, in theory, in principle, is always limited. It's not unlimited. So as long as time is not zero, rate will be limited. But the question is, how much is it limited? So once again, the question is not if rate of something, rate of power production, rate of this or that is limited, but how much is it limited, and by what? Or what is the limitation to rate? Then I wrote to myself to use pens to explain to you or demonstrate the next idea. So here's the myosin. Okay, it's the thick filament. So this thick marker represents myosin, and this thin one represents actin. Now I want you to imagine, you know what, maybe I can find something in my drawer that would actually help me explain this. Just a second. Nope, I'm not in luck. You're gonna have to imagine that there's a cord or a thread tied to the thick filament and then at the same time tied to the thin filament, okay? And now look what happens. If there's a cord here, okay, when I go this way, the tension in the cord is increased, right? But when I go back to the middle, it decreases. And that's exactly what's going on in the sarcomere with the filaments. They have a connection. We know that the myosin has an arm, a lever that connects to a site, what we call the bonding site, on the actin filament. And now that connection causes tension, but throughout the relative movement of the filaments, the tension in that connection, what we call a cross bridge of the sarcomere, changes. And since tension mechanically is a force, you are changing the force that is generated by the work of the sarcomere. That means that the length and how much the filaments are parallel to each other, okay? What percentage of them is parallel to each other causes changes in the force produced. So this would be the lengthening of the sarcomere, and this would be the shortening of the sarcomere. And then you have what we call isometric work, whereas work is produced, but there's no change in the length of the sarcomere. So that's what you see here in slide number 16. And then also there is the frequency of the activation. The frequency changes how the sarcomere is going to work, or how the myosin actin cross bridges are going to affect the production of power. Then we see in slide 17 that we need sometimes more than one action potential, what I wrote here is AP, to produce a twitch, to produce an actual result, Then in regards to the second point on slide 17, I wrote this is a local phenomenon of the neurologic system, of the nervous system. Okay. Then we can talk about, still in regards to slide 17, that power is the balance or the ratio, the relationship between force and time. Maximal power, explosive power, is maximal force divided by minimal time, what we call all-out performance. Then in regards to slide 18, we can talk about the idea of pH of less than 6.9. Obviously, neutral pH is a 7. We know that, for instance, the blood needs to be 6.9, and we see that this is definitely acidosis, which will cause neural impairment because the nervous system, neurons, do not operate well under acidic conditions. If they don't operate well under acidic conditions, and they're supposed to tell the muscles what to do and activate them and regulate their work, then you have a problem. And then we see that we have two major chemical factors important to the actual connection, the creation of the cross bridges in the sarcomere, which without them you literally don't have almost any power in the system. Sorry, I forgot to put in, to move the mouse or put in my password and it's shutting down. I hate this part. I'm so sorry. So without magnesium and calcium, you're not going to have a change of conformation of the actin of the thin filament, and you won't have myosin connecting to it, hence you won't have a cross bridge, and the whole idea of the sarcomere being able mechanically to produce power is lost. So we can talk about slide 19, and slide 19 entails two major ideas. First, the need for a physical connection in order to produce power, that those are the cross bridges, and if that physical connection decreases, or the amount of cross bridges, or their higher state of energy, you have less power production. And then you need to multiply, not only, you need to take in consideration not only how many connections you have, but also the energetic potential of each one of the connections. And then the overall power that you will have, or the result, depends on the amount of the connections times the potential of each one. And then we can say that the ratio, the relationship between the two, is how much, depends on how much calcium you have divided by the force that you've produced, meaning that you can understand how the force is dependent upon the concentration or the amount of calcium. So we can talk about strong connections, in this case of the sarcomere, being 3D dependent, meaning that you have to have a certain 3D conformation change from low state, energy state, to the higher one to achieve those higher ones. If something doesn't change in the space of the sarcomere, you won't be able to reach that high state of energy, meaning it's not only chemical, there's also a mechanical or 3D aspect to it to allow the utilization of the potential of that high energy state. Then, of course, if we're talking about a cycle of something connecting and then disconnecting and then connecting and disconnecting and connecting and disconnecting, what affects the rate, the total or the maximal amount of times that this process can happen per minute or per hour or per second, per any unit of time, is not only the time that it takes to connect, but also the time that it takes to disconnect, what we call here disassociation. All right, so that is what is said in regards to the third point on slide 20. And then the 21st slide of the presentation addresses an interesting idea, whereas fatigue is not absolute, rather than something that accumulates. It accumulates, it has stages, and the more it accumulates and you advance in the stages of this schematic, the worse off you are. The second point that you can talk about in this slide is that the accumulation and fatigue is not linear. Okay, so the more it accumulates, the more on you go, the fatigue levels get higher and higher, and you get in trouble faster as time passes. Then we have slide 22, and I wrote two remarks about this. One, obviously we're talking about isometric work because we see that we have the sarcomere working without changes to length. So that's isometric by definition. But also the idea that in order for a muscle to reach that, a real live muscle, not in vitro, to reach that isometric state, it still has to have a dynamic state first. So movement first, and then the lack of movement or change to length of sarcomere. So meaning that you otherwise, where's the energy coming from? Okay, so we still have to create cross bridges in order to create power and strength and work, even though it's through a very specific mechanism of the sarcomere where energy is produced, power is produced, but the sarcomere at that time is not changing its length. What else? Then we can talk about the force velocity or force power relationships. And here's the two things that I wrote about slide number 24, the one with the table. One, here's a question. When can a person run faster? With or without load? So you see that's in regards to the first point that says that Vmax is greater when load is zero. Of course it is. Of course it is. Of course a muscle can contract. Of course anything can move better or faster when resistance, in this case load, assuming that the load is causing resistance, is zero. Makes sense, right? It's kind of logical. So that's what that says. And then in the second point, of course, the relationship talked about is the idea of the connection, reconnection of the cross bridges. So that's what you see in the table that appears as cross bridge cycle speed, meaning how fast or slow does it take you to connect and disconnect the cross bridges. Then in regards to slide number 25, in regards to the third point or to the formula there, we're talking about the balance between fast fiber types and slow fiber types, and I'll just remind you that the average muscle tends to have a mixture of 50-50. Okay, so that's where it comes from, but that's a tendency. That's not completely what you will see. Then in regards to slide 26, I want to say that we see here a point, especially in the second point, that more than the ability to produce peak power, it is important in most physical tasks that will involve muscles, obviously, to be able to sustain the power produced, not only produce it. Okay? So let's say you work on a daily basis and you get paid per day. What is more important, assuming that life is more than a day? To get the high, to reach a peak high payment one day out of the month, or to be able to sustain a certain income on a daily basis? Obviously, per month, there's 30, 31 days a month, give or take a bit, right? In most months, you want to be paid every day in order to have a full month payment. So that's the idea of sustaining something versus hitting a one-time peak. Um, okay, I'm going to stop here and continue from central fatigue. Stay tuned.